Las víctimas campesinas de Colombia llevamos 100.
The farmers that are victims of family have been 103 days living in the streets, and we're not homeless people.
Yo vengo del Caquetá.
I come from Caquetá.
De estar en la calle. Yo le doy a darle a conocer al
I
gobierno.
am going to let the government know that we're not
Estamos en una
in a protest. We're not taking over the streets. We're not in a manifestation or nothing from that style. We are living on the streets because they left us on the streets. We are claiming our lands.
Yo soy de Barquisimeto, del pueblo llamado Duaca.
I'm from a town called Huaca. I came to improve my situation because there's no secret that the situation in Venezuela is difficult, and we try to immigrate in order to have a better job and to help our families.
Mi nombre es Roger
My
José.
name is Roger José Mendoza Arena. I am 27 years old. I'm approximately, I've been in Colombia for approximately 4 years now.
No podemos retornar. Toca ir a cocinar. Acá nos ponemos de acuerdo.
Not able to return, we have to go and cook. In order just to survive, we have to come together and we have to cooperate in order to put our grain of salt, because we are simply survivors. Let me tell you. Here we don't have no electricity. We don't have water, running water. We don't have the comforts that a human being should actually need.
La situación de desplazamiento en Colombia
The displacement situation in Colombia can characterize as a displacement that is prolonged, not only due to the continuing situation of displacement, but in order to reflect the new situations of displacements throughout the country. It's also a reconfiguration of the conflict and the situation of violence within the country, even after the peace process. And the level of attention that we have seen, that we've had, like creation of institutions for transitional justice.
Como en todas partes del mundo.
Just like any part of the world, we don't have enough assistance for people. Needs are overwhelming. They're gigantic. There are tons of needs in this country. However, jointly, all the different stakeholders and the cooperating agents, humanitarian and aid and institutions, and other different actors like the church and private sector stakeholders are uniting their efforts in order to help in their first response and humanitarian response when people first arrive. Do you receive any type of help? Internal displacement, yes, 76%, no, 24%. Vulnerable population, yes, 62%, no, 38%. Venezuelan migrants, no, 52%. When we talk about assistance and social protection, we're not only talking about receiving a program like, for example, Families in Action or Solidarity Income. No, it's much bigger than that. We also explore different gaps in access to education. Like, for example, we see that Venezuelan children going to school was much less than the local Colombian population, and the Venezuelan population had less access to health, and that predominantly they always work in informal jobs. There was a moment that we only had to eat twice a day. Thanks to God, we ate twice a day at least. But yes, but we eliminated fruits and juices, like I told you before. In fact, there were some very critical weeks where it was only rice and lentils the whole week. I've never received help, and my daughter was hospitalized due to hepatitis, and the next day they gave her back and they were charging me 380,000, and I didn't have them because I just arrived. They only just filled out some paperwork, and they said that I had to pay 50 because that was the only thing that I was able to pay at that time. In the interviews, we found that many times the people that are displaced externally, when they asked about the relationship with the internal displaced populations or even with the embracing population or the host population, many times they said we've had xenophobia experiences, discrimination, or many times, for example, when we have like food stamps for going to supermarkets and they know we're displaced, maybe they look at us uncomfortably. But the issue for rent, we've seen rent where it says not for Venezuelans, and that's a xenophobic action. And even if it seems something small, it keeps growing. The more time passes, less aid arrives, the less aid that arrives. Helping people is more than simply a social program, but we need to generate conditions so that people can grow fully. And that's why we consider education very important, and access to health is also important because the people that are healthy do better in school and at job. Food security is hugely important due to nutritional factors because it's also associated to health and access to jobs. In terms of public policies, the government's going to have to work on all of this as well. Not only as how we design programs and what type of aid we provide, but also in social cohesion issues and how we're going to manage these relationships so that all the social issues can be adequately managed.
Nadie se ha pronunciado.
Nobody has actually pronounced nor manifested themselves. The situation that we have is crucial. We are living in the streets. We came to live here because we are on the streets. And from here, where do we go? To the streets again, because there are no solutions.
Mi anhelo regresar. Como te dije, le agradezco mucho a Colombia.
Like I said, I thank Colombia infinitely with all its difficulties and its complexities. I still thank Colombia because thanks to Colombia, my daughter has had good food. She has had good clothing. She is dressed properly, something that it's complicated in Venezuela. She has had access to education. I found the coloring book. And I had to stop and I couldn't continue because the situation didn't allow me. I've worked and I'm trying to send some money home so they can buy some construction materials so I can have some at home back in Venezuela.
Muy buenos días.
Very good day to everybody. Welcome to the School of Government in Andes University. We are very pleased after these 2 years of pandemic to actually be able to have this in-person or semi-virtual presentation. We have several people on our Facebook Live channel as well, and on YouTube as well, Facebook Live, and we have an on-site, in-person public, which is very important for us. I wanted to especially greet Paula Gaviria, the director of Compass Foundation. She's here with us today. Also, Gabriel Demon Beans. I'm not sure if I pronounced your last name properly, but we are very pleased to have you here. He's a human development officer in the World Bank in Colombia. Santiago Guzman from UNHCR, Ingrid Battinson and Ivan Jimenez from the OIM, and Tania Nino from the World Food Program, which we had the pleasure of speaking. We will speak more during today's morning with her. Today's a very special day in the School of Government because after 2 years of working rigorously in a cross-cutting, multi-method fashion, accompanied by ODI, and with the help of many different researchers from the School of Government, we were able to have the results that we're going to share today with all of you. This is about a study that actually looks at conditions from displaced populations, forced displacement, displaced due to the internal armed conflict in Colombia, as well as the displaced population that was forcibly displaced from Venezuela to Colombia. And basically, we wanted to look at their living conditions, but also the role of social assistance and the social protection system, trying to improve it and to guarantee these living conditions. So the idea for today is to let you know about what was done in these last years or months of data collection and analyzing this information, but especially with the hopes of trying to see the implications on public policies for the incoming government. And we hope that this is information that is very useful for the national government and the local governments, but also for international cooperation. What we're going to do next is to present two of the leaders of this project, Andres Hams and Maria Cecilia de Dios. They're going to present the results of the study, and after we're going to have a small break, and then we'll have a panel which will speak about the different implications that these policies have. Now, Andres Ham has the word, one of the leaders of this project, and welcome, Andres. Thank you so much, Sandra. Social Protection Response for Forced Displacement in Colombia by Andres Ham from the School of Government. Well, thank you very much, Sandra, for that introduction. As you can imagine, when we want to study displaced populations, there's a lot to talk about. And if you've seen the report online, it's a bit long. So what we're going to do in these presentations is to give you a brief summary of some of the key areas. But let's begin by the recognitions. We're clearly not the only ones that are studying this, and this project is part of a much bigger project, which is this one, which is called Living Evidence About Forced Displacements, which is prolonged with several different fundraising bodies and financing. And second, something that's important is we have to recognize the team that's working on this, because there was many people that actually put their sweat into all of this, and we wanted to ensure that we recognize the authors, the researchers, the collaborators, the assistants, the people that helped us with the field work, like the national consulting centers, and also people that created this event and are helping out right now, and we wouldn't be here without everybody. Well, the big question that we want to try to deal with here is the people are in constant movement, but what happens is there are two types of movements. When migrants move in search for more benefits, like good movements where we seek better opportunities. I'm like from Honduras, and I live in Colombia, and I've lived in USA and Argentina and other places. So I move around because that benefits me. But other are almost like thrown out of their point of origin because of conflict or political crisis or for another reason. And that's the population that we're dealing with today. And as Sandra said in the introduction, perhaps the most important thing is this term of people that are forcibly displaced. Historically in Colombia, this has been due to internal armed conflict, but now we have this wave of Venezuelan migrants that we consider that these two are focal points of interest. And in the report, you're going to see that we'll begin with a series of questions, smaller questions that try to answer that bigger question. Like, what is the situation that these people that are forcibly displaced are living? What is their conditions? What are their social assistance and their social protection? And what can we do in the future to help them? And we break this down into several other things. In my presentation, I'm going to focus on two of these 5 questions. And I'm going to give you more or less certain numbers of how coverage is in assistance and in social protection, and also tell you a little bit about how it's how the well-being of these people is when they receive assistance. Another thing that Sandra said in her introduction, and something that we want to highlight from this investigation from the School of Government, is that we use mixed methods. So we went to collect surveys in Bogota and in Cucuta during the pandemic. This was in January of 2021, if I remember correctly, where we focused on populations from the lower stratus 1 through 3 for the host association and the migrants and the people that are displaced, and looking at Venezuelans. This was a survey of about 1,500 people that allowed us to collect data that did not exist previously. Many times, hopefully we'll show this to you today, and then this is the quality component that Maria Cecilia was going to tell you, so I'm not going to spoil this. So like I told you, I'm going to focus mostly on the results from this survey that we actually had. And here we have more or less a screenshot of who participated in our surveys, and we compared this with the larger home survey. Our population is much more vulnerable because we're focused on stratus 1 through 3, people that it was more probable that they received any type of assistance or aid. So let me show you a series of graphs. The first thing, out of these 3 populations, how is the coverage in terms of social assistance? And when I say social assistance, I want to say transfer programs, like, for example, monetary transfers, or maybe like food stamps or groceries. But we also define social protection more broadly. It also includes access to education, access to health, access to formal jobs, these types of things, as a more holistic view that we wanted to take here. So here we have all the 3 populations that receive assistance in general, which are the first 3 bars: who receives cash and who receives in actual goods. And here you're going to see a pattern that keeps getting repeated in the graphs, which are the people that are displaced due to the conflict have more coverage in terms of social assistance program, whether in cash or in goods. And then the population from the host community, and then lastly, the Venezuelan people. And if you notice, if we look at numbers in general, we see 62% of the people in our survey were people that were displaced and that received some sort of assistance. Only 16% of Venezuelans is reported, but the help for Venezuelans is very similar in cash or in goods, but many of the programs of transfers are more focused on Colombians. But who's paying the bill? Who's footing the bill, as we said? Well, so we asked the question, who, this help that you're receiving, who is providing it? And the great majority told us that it came from the government. At least in the host population, and then more than 90% of them report that it came from the government. And it appears several other people told us others, and we asked for more details. And in those details, like, for example, we see several different graphs here. On one side, we see that international community is helping much more in the Venezuelan communities themselves. And this is also very important. But we also have churches and individuals and different community grassroots organizations, which is something that we didn't expect, but we thought it was very interesting that the communities themselves, they're trying to see how they can help these communities, which also helps to understand that maybe thinking about the future, these are some stakeholders that we need to speak with as well. That many times we think about governments, we think about these, that there are other organizations at a local level that can actually be very useful for these endeavors. What else did we also realize? If we separate this or break it down by programs, And these bars that are dotted or not or lined, these became pre-pandemic. The rest already exists. If we start to compare the different bars, I think that the blue bars are the Venezuelans. As we see that the coverage in terms of Venezuelan people increased more, so that in these programs, would start during the pandemic. So in a certain fashion, this indicates, or this is suggestive evidence that due to the pandemic, we were able to reincorporate more Venezuelan people than in programs that historically that they were excluded from. And some other issues in terms of goods is pretty high as well. And we also asked the people if they were on the CSBEN database. This is a big push that the DMP is actually trying to push right now, to try to have the CSBEN survey to many of them Venezuelan migrants and have them be in the CSBEN database. And since our sample was more focused on vulnerable populations, we saw that many of the people from the displaced population was registered. And we also found that more or less 44% of the people that from Venezuela was telling us that they were registered in the CSBEN. So this can happen due to two different reasons. One, that there's still a lack of knowledge about CSBEN. Maybe people think that it's a health insurance, like for example, being like part of the health subsidized system. But another thing that we thought was very important, that what happens is that there's a great deal of mixed nationality homes as well. So perhaps we may be in a home and three people are there. There's one Colombian person and a Venezuelan person and a Honduran person, and the Colombian person has CSBEN, but as a home we all have CSBEN. And that dynamic was very interesting, and that doesn't really show up so common, and we thought that was very interesting as well. It's a good number of people that actually have these types of mixed nationality homes. So that was pretty interesting. And in the report, you'll find many more details about what programs they receive, how much money they receive, what subsidies they received, if they receive it on time or it's delayed, if there were problems of applying to these programs, it was difficult, etc. I don't want to take too much time about telling you about all of this, but as I told you, assistance and social protection is something that's bigger and more global. One thing is that I receive a social program and that I get maybe groceries, but there are certain positions that I need. And more specifically, so that children and teenagers can develop and to have access to education. So we asked about schooling. This is for all the kids at home. And they told us that we have general assistance for school in general, and for underage children, some kindergartens or preschools. And for the Colombian activities and displaced people, it's more or less at 90% of kids are going to school or to any types of educational center. And for Venezuelan people, it's only 67%. It's more than half, but it's still way below the local population's percentages. So the rate of preschool was pretty low. It's very low in Latin America, but only 1 out of every 3 kids is actually going to these preschools. And we know that early childhood development is a very important factor. So that needs to be looked at. And let's look at access to health. So we asked the people if they have any type of medical coverage, and if whether they went to a hospital or if they went to a clinic or if they went to look for help, and whether they gave them that help or they provided that aid. And the patterns are repeated that we saw in education. For example, the local population has health coverage, not necessarily to everybody that goes, they cater to them or to the system, but the access to the Venezuelan population more specifically is much lower. So in a certain fashion, this is like a story we're going to see some good things and some not so good things. And we focus on stratus 1 and 3, but this is the formality rates, how many people actually and pay for Social Security, health, and pension. And we also asked them if the person who was the one that paid the person that won the most money or whatever. But look here. So the highest value was more or less 50%. So the national for let's say that at the country's level, only 50% are formal. But in the most vulnerable population, the fact that we found that, but for the host community or the incoming community, only 1 out of 3 are actually paying for health and pension. Under this formality definition, there are 2 informal workers for every formal worker. And for the Venezuelan population, basically, this is telling us that it's much higher. Okay, so there's a lot of data and we see certain patterns, so we can say, well, or we can ask, so there's gaps in who receives and who doesn't receive and what they receive according to these services. A second question, which we also make ourselves in the report, is what happens? Are these people that receive these subsidies really doing better or not? And then we asked the questions that was very subjective, asking people if the support that they received, if they consider it to be irrelevant or a little important or indispensable or very important. And about half of the population said it was super important or indispensable. So subjectively speaking, they think that this support is very important, but we do a whole additional exercise apart from that, because there's something else that we don't have in this study, like maybe seeing if we receive these programs or if this improves your life or it doesn't improve your life. In reality, we didn't find many significant evidence with hard data related to what generated, like when Maria Silvia is coming, that the quality signs, like things that we can't really see in the numbers, for example, we didn't really get too much of this quality information. And apart from that, with the data, we see different possibilities. And there's also much more evidence because we do an analysis, not only if they receive or not receive, but if the amount that they receive is important, or if they receive it in the short term or in the long term. And another message that comes out in the quality and also in the quantity is that many people speak that it's good to receive short-term subsidies, but in reality, what they need is instead is a midterm and long-term path, maybe toward a job or something more formal to be able to truly improve their conditions. Like they say that short-term help is very useful. Yes, clearly they need them. However, that's not the only way to help these populations. So to summarize, what I wanted to tell you is that we collected data that we did not have in the past. We did an analysis very diligently, very extensively in the report. So I invite you to read those reports. And in terms of protection and of these populations, and like, what is the main takeaway here from all of this? And as a team, I think we could tell you that this is like the glass that's half empty, half full analogy. The fact that displaced people, internal displacement, have more coverage in terms of assistance and in terms of education and health is telling us that something is being done in order to prioritize victims. So on that note, we can interpret it suggestively, like things are being done properly, trying to help victims above the non-displaced population. But we also have a half-empty side, because now the challenge is that the Venezuelan migrants are very delayed in these coverages in terms of social protection and assistance. And we would like to try to balance these things up. What I told you a little bit, a lot of the coverage comes from the government, but another important takeaway is that we have, it seems that many people identify that what they receives from the government, there are many other organizations that play a fundamental role here. And I think working together and this joint work is very important as well in order to think about the future. And as I told you, in the data that our survey shows, which is a small survey with a very specific showcase or sample, we didn't find a direct association between receiving some sort of assistance in social protection and the well-being measures that we measure. However, what I told you earlier, like a good segue for the next presentation, is that the voices of the beneficiaries are showing us that sometimes the numbers don't give us all the information. And that's why what we're highlighting the importance of doing this research with mixed methods like we did it in order to try to capture this properly. So for the people that are here in person, how can we give them this link? Well, we're going to give you a copy of the report in English, the people that are here in person. But then you can also find the two reports in English and in Spanish on this website here. And let me not leave without telling you that if we go back to the first slide, that this is a project that is within a larger framework, a larger study. There are several works that have been done from the Overseas Development Institute under this umbrella that can also be consulted, because this study, this case study in Colombia, this is one of 3 that were done in this larger, broader program. And in fact, forced displacement is a big problem worldwide. As you see, we have the Russian-Ukrainian war, but also Greece has had many displacement. We have the Syrian population. In Africa, we see many of these cases, and there are many documents here that you can consult if you are interested in seeing other additional factors related to forced displacement. Thank you.
Buenos días a todos, buenos días a todas. Bienvenidos. Okay, good morning, everybody. I am Maria Cecilia Vivas. I'm a consultant from the government, and as Andres was telling us, I will tell you about the component, the collective component of our organization. As you know, this was a multi-method where we'll see the perspective of people using different methodologies, both in surveys as with in-depth interviews. And I wouldn't want to start this presentation. Let me see. There you go. I want to start by expressing my gratitude to the collective component research team. It was a lot of people doing these data gathering and analysis, so I wanted to start there. So once again, thank you everybody for the wonderful work. So then I wanted to introduce key issues of what we found, as we've said, by talking with people through different methods. And I wanted to start somehow by emphasizing some of the results you had heard about the surveys and the power of qualitative methods in such a study of this would be to understand the perspective of people and to know how the public policy is actually being worked on the fields. So I'm going to look into a couple of findings that were stressed in the investigation. First, about the gap that there is in the access of people because of the group they belong to. Meaning we found in the survey that those that are displaced have, in general, most access than those in the Colombian community to aid, while migrants had less access than displaced people and people within the community in Colombia. So from the qualitative component, we decided to look into what was the experience of access for people according to the group they belong to services. We wanted to understand if this is a gap that actually needs to look into structural components, and it also needs to have something to do with the access pathways and what happens in that level from people experience. Also, as Andres was telling you, there is a weak qualitative relationship between SCAP and the attendance. And that is something we believe it was important to look from the qualitative, because in the qualitative, you don't only understand whether is there a relationship but you actually go to the question of what do people understand by well-being? What is it that they feel is to be better? And what's the relationship they may find between receiving help and being better? And so that was one of the questions that we asked from the qualitative standpoint. And then part of that, we had a component of interviews to key informants and decision makers, because we also needed to understand the processes through which humanitarian aid and international aid and the services from the government were or not integrated, were or not coordinated, to what levels are they being covered, if it has a relationship. So what are the challenges also that for all of us inside could be, and those are our decision makers in terms of integration. So those are the things that I'm going to address today, a little bit about the method. So as we told you, we had in-depth interviews and also with Venezuelan migrants, displaced people internally by conflict and by population that we've received, and also with decision makers and governmental agencies, international agencies, to have their perspectives on the integration process of humanitarian aid and social protection services. This is the sample we had in the interviews and focal teams. We carried out interviews and focal teams in Cucuta and Bogota, where we divided people between beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries. And on the key informants, those who have experience in public policy in Bogota, the local public policy in Cucuta, and also at the local domestic level, both displaced and migrants in general. But today, particularly with Venezuelan migration. Some key findings on access, assistance, and social protection services. And first, we started to look at when we had the most coverage of social assistance for displaced people. What we found was that those that are displaced, they knew that they had access to benefit, probably better than the rest, about the requirements and processes to access to this social protection aid. So they knew about the logics of it. How does it work? What is it that is required? What are the processes, the offices? Who do I have to talk to? And that was particularly true for those that were registered in the single victim record. It's important when we talk about displaced people, they were to admit, yes, I was displaced by violence. And within that group, there are those that are registered as victim in that record. So for instance, in one of our focal groups, there was a person saying, okay, they call it a compensation today, an indemnization after a displacement. And then you should fill out a form and enroll in a list. And so what this is telling us is all these people know about the process and what they do to access the service. And about the boundaries, we found that there were a lot, logistics, technological, in terms of time and money, but a particular boundary that we found with displaced people was that idea of the requirements to be recognized as a victim of a conflict, to be in the single victim record, and the delays to receive the aid, transfer, and all of that public aid there have the right to. So one of the interviews in Bogota, one of those people told us we were displaced. And then in time, I started work and then I became, I was in an organization and a company, so I didn't want to go and ask for help because I felt like begging for money. And that's the thing, that having access to this service that's the feeling, and they don't feel that they are entitled to being given that assistance. And that's what came out a lot. In terms of less coverage, then the same question, and what's happening. And what we found was that the migrants find it very difficult to access to this assistance, which was opposed to what we found with the victims of the conflict. And this wasn't so only on their side, but like Andres told us in the surveys, they were also telling us that there were many other ways to receive help, and it has to do with the multiplicity of offer that they have coming from different areas, like the government, the international organizations, but also from churches. And so there is like a confusion of what do I need and what for. But it's very important to highlight here that the experience to this services and to any kind of aid varies from the person's migrating status, whether they have documents or not to be in Colombia, whether they're legal, and also the way of their conformance of the household, which also came out in the survey from the qualitative. So if I'm in a house where there are Colombian nationals, then I need to understand how does the access work in terms of access to services, that is, and also to be able to access CISBEN. So there were households that only have Venezuelan nationals, and to see how could they register, to see how they could enter CISBEN and how they could do it. And then in one of the focal points with non-beneficiaries in Bogota, this person is telling us, okay, having a Colombian cedula is one thing. I don't have it, but with it, it's different. But in the case of migrants that only have passports and PEPs, then there may be AIDS. I can't say there aren't, but I don't know anyone who has gotten it. In that regard, we also wonder about the strategies migrants use to be able to access this assistance. And we found a strategy of diversifying options. They say, I'll register to any list. Any list that comes up, I'll go. And something that also varies a lot with Venezuelan migrants is that they depend a lot of a support network. They pass the information as a mouth-to-mouth information, and it happens a lot with them, but it didn't happen so much with the displaced people. While Venezuelans migrants were saying, but this or that person told me, go to that place and stuff like that. You can see that. It's something we found, like for instance, a mom with a lady in an interview. She was a migrant who accessed the program, and she was telling us, since I'm always working, I pay a friend so that she can take my daughter and take her to school and bring her back to me. So I imagine you're talking about a bonus. It's a bonus that they're given for 7 months. And the lady tells me that, and then I tell her I don't have the time because I'm working. And then she says, no, you just have to talk to the school director. And then they had an online meeting with me. And then they told me that those kids that had not received the bonus was because they were not registered or didn't have ID, etc. So that was a process. So then the teacher registered my child. And you see, this is all exemplified. It's not they may not understand where that assistance comes from, but to get enrolled in because of that support network that they have, and even from the institutionality, which in this case was the school or a school director who helped register the child. This is something that certainly wasn't happening, or we wouldn't hear much about with displaced people. Finally, we found that migrants have specific boundaries to receive economic support because they receive more of that support and rather than in money, they receive it in kind. So it was also a bank account that they would need to access, but they couldn't because of the migration status. They don't have an identification document or access to a permanent phone number. In other words, they have access to a cell phone, but they're constantly changing it or sharing it with others. So having a permanent phone number to receive a transfer is something that doesn't work so good for them. And then their fear to reveal their migration status in front of a certain authorities, or there's of course fear to stigmatization. They didn't want to be stigmatized. And so when we started talking about the helping kind, they said that they were not receiving, they were not having as many issues, that those that actually received them got them well, or their assistant in kind. But then the transfer, money transfer were different. Now, another big issue I wanted to talk about was the relationship between assistance and social protection, talking about AIDS here, helping people with that. As Andres had told you before, people receiving social assistance with all the groups that we talked about were very grateful for these short-term assistance that would arrive at the time when they were really at the end of the rope. So it was God's blessings. You know, they were telling us we didn't have, we were about to not have anything to eat, and then we received it. So by all of them, it was perceived as an actual help that gets you out of trouble. But that's very different to saying that this assistance would contribute to the general well-being in a mid or long term. So here, I believe it's important to gather these feelings in the interviews, and every group is in the focal groups. And it's like, what's the meaning these groups give and what they think it's the role of the government in terms of their responsibility. And here we find something very important as a difference between both groups. For displaced people, the government is obligated to help them because they are displaced because of the failure of the government to protect them. So the government is in debt with them. And any failure, any boundaries for access are felt as additional failure that pile up in this duty the government has to protect them. But then Venezuelan migrants have a different approach. They say, okay, by concept, all governments have responsibility with the migrants. But they also say there is Colombian vulnerable population, and they feel that as something good the government is doing for them, despite the many responsibilities they have with Colombian citizens, and the feeling they have is mostly gratitude. So the failure in the access are felt differently, and that of course has implications for the well-being in general, and how these failures are felt in terms of the well-being as they feel it. Then when we receive this concept and hear what's the connection between that and the social assistance and the well-being of a person, and here's what we heard about people. And clearly assistance was important on the everyday, but they don't allow to have a mid and long-term response. And when we go and see what people are saying, what displaced people are saying, and what the migrants are saying in regards to that relationship between social assistance and the well-being, for displaced people to be well, what they would need, particularly those that are in the single victim record, this single payment of indemnization, they see it as an opportunity to improve the situation of life or a seed capital And so this money that can really help them to be better. For Venezuelan migrants, what we heard over and over was this helped me on an everyday, but what I need is a way to work, to have a normal, regular status in the country so that I can access to a better quality of life. So there's this idea of the work that of what I could help me, and it's to actually have the opportunity to work. And this is then going beyond the formal and informal work, and it's the migrating status. A small deviation here. It's important to emphasize that we go into the context where there's reconnected qualitative and quantitative information. At the time when we were going out to field for the focal groups, it was a time when we were all at home, and it was a nightmare for anybody. So we had to somehow adapt our technology to doing phone interviews and focal points online. So we decided to adapt our methodology to our focal points via WhatsApp, and we believe it could work because of how familiar people are with WhatsApp. That's something we felt, oh, these are groups of people we talk to. And so this can be a way to actually reach these people to gather this information. We obviously have the issue of people who couldn't be able to participate because of their access to mobile phones, but we still decided to include them. And this methodological innovation in response to the lockups had to do with the availability of people. Everybody's coming, and we have a conversation all together with the topic. And so what we did was we had a focal point for a whole week where the researchers were going to send questions in the mornings or in the afternoons, always keeping in mind like the moment when people could have a time to answer at the lunchtime, for instance. And so we started to sort of juggle with time and seeing what we could have to gather these answers, to thinking about the time of others.
This is something that actually worked very well for us, the issue of availability of time, which is so important for anybody that has worked with migrant populations, with displaced people. They know that it's very difficult to take 2 hours of their time to speak with somebody. And I think that this was something very positive. Something else that actually worked quite well, since we didn't require immediate responses, people could actually take their time to think about their answers, to think about what they wanted to say. So we had answers that were truly more thought out, that were actually more meditated upon. And so that was something positive and actually worked quite well. The communication ways or methodology, this is also a good discovery. The people sent us emojis, the people sent images, voice notes, when instead of writing you, they don't have time to write, they would just send you a voice note. And these things work quite well, and it allowed people to express themselves in very different fashions, different from traditional routes. And finally, this is also part of the data analysis, but it was much easier because we already had the transcripts, and we transcribed the voice notes, we described the different images, and we already had the data that was ready to be analyzed. There were certain modifications as well, and we share these with the hope that if this is useful, welcome, and hopefully you can replicate it. There was also modifications in the logistics, the issue of the informed consent that had to be sent via WhatsApp. Here you have a picture of how it works. With Mariana, she's an expert. The modifications and the moderation as well. There's also an issue of individual skills via WhatsApp group and not face to face, and trying to follow up some things on the internal fashion. Hey, what's going on? Do you have any questions or any worries? So there was different channels which we were able to use to generate the discussion, and the main issue was confidentiality. And I think this is an important thing in a focal group. And there wasn't such a possibility at the beginning to say, hey, how are we going to handle this problem related to confidentiality? So what we did was basically to create videos and tutorials of how to erase, to delete information. And I think, give me a second because I want to show you some of the details of how all of this worked. We're going to follow the next steps in order to eliminate the conversation from the focal group. First, we go into the WhatsApp conversation from the focal group. Then we click on the three dots on the plus button. And then we click on empty chat. And then we click on empty once again. Then we'll see how immediately all the conversation was deleted in order to guarantee confidentiality in the focal group. Thank you so much for your very valuable participation during this week. That's just an example of the multiple small videos that we had. We had videos of presentations from the researchers, how it's going to work in the focal groups. And as you saw, the data here, et cetera, et cetera. So these were ways that we used or we invented on the go so that these focal groups can actually work properly. And I think the final balance was actually very positive. Lessons learned so well. So the issue of moderating focal groups online is a challenge that requires constant attention during the implementation period. So it was a whole week where we were there behind the scenes and cell phone trying to generate these discussions so that the focal groups would not die. The issues of specific skills for moderation is also very important, especially for WhatsApp. I think it's important to highlight that as well. It's like you have to have a sense of interpersonal abilities so that people that have never seen themselves will want to speak about the fear to being stigmatized or stigmatization toward Venezuela. So we need a lot of abilities, interpersonal abilities, and skills to generate high quality data. And finally, as I told you, the issue related to access to cell phones was a challenge, especially in the migrant population. In our particular case, we only needed to have access to the cell phone for 1 week. So the issue of rotating cell phones wasn't that complicated, but we were ensuring that, for example, they had access for a whole week to unlimited data plans so that they can participate in the focal group. And then in the experience as well, this experience also helped us. We saw in real time many of the different challenges and barriers that had been reported in the past or are being reported in terms of access to services for the assistance in social protection. And the last point that I wanted to talk about is related to the link of humanitarian assistance with social protection. And this is like a bit of a stepping stone to the panel that's coming next, where we interviewed key informants or people that actually know, like the people that understand how public policies and programs are actually generated for the different populations that we're working with. So one thing that we wanted to do is if there was any link that existed between humanitarian aid and social protection, we wanted to understand that in order to for migrant populations and also for displaced population, we want to understand to up to what point there was an actual communication between humanitarian aid and assistance and social protection. And for the issue of internal displacement, what we found is that obviously Colombia has decades of experience in managing public policies and programs for displaced peoples. So there is a legal framework that currently exists, which is very broad in its scope, so that the government can effectively provide assistance. We find that this assistance mainly is going to happen at a national level, and international programs basically are more focused on new displacements. International humanitarian is more immediate in nature, which is obviously necessary immediately after the displacement occurs. In one way or another, the international offerings and the government's offers are more or less working together or integrated in terms that the international offers continues to follow the government's policies. They use mechanisms for coordinating with the government, and they use administrative systems that are joint systems, which is different in the case of Venezuelan immigration. For Venezuelan immigration, so migrants, obviously, the Colombian government continues to provide the great majority of the support in the service. And the growing international response is aligning itself more and more with these issues, and in more specific cases, like cases that we can learn from, this is integrated plainly completely with the government systems. Like for example, examples of how there's coordination mechanisms, joint sharing of data and databases, cases of integrated financing, where financing from the international level is channeled directly via government services. but these are certain specific cases. These are not the rules. These are not what is the most common. And we find that what our key informants told us that we don't have a key broad policy that allows us to integrate this as a response to Venezuelan migration. So there is space for improvement in this field. When we also asked, and what were or why did they why how was the process of integrating some of the service? The key informants actually let us know that basically it was determined by the emergency of the situation, especially during COVID, the magnitude and the long-term vision for the displacement crisis. These are factors that catalyze this integration between the humanitarian aid and social protection services. In the specific case of migrants, for example, political willingness from the government has to be clear with a key role. And we see that this idea of this comes from the top down, and progressive policies toward immigration and COVID as well. COVID was a very important catalyst in order to integrate these immediate responses and humanitarian responses for social protection in the midterm and the long term. Finally, when we speak about integration issues, our key informants told us or gave us a view of the advantages and some of the challenges that they see with the integration. Obviously, not necessarily do we see a state of absolute integration, which is where we would really like to get at. But when we spoke about integration, clearly from the government, we have different stakeholders. From the government, basically what we were told is that it's good because there's less duplication of and more benefits. We're expanding coverage and benefits, greater capacities for the institutions, and we're gaining new resources. That's the advantage of a greater integration between humanitarian aid and social protection. From international organizations, this was also seen as something positive, basically through the optimization of resources that are limited by nature, expanding coverage, being able to think more about the long term, identifying gaps of what's working poorly in the offerings of the programs. Like the integration allows you or gives you the possibility to do this from the action of international organizations as well. But as I told you, also there are certain challenges that exist that are important. One of the things that our informants, key informants, told us once kept repeating related to the difficulties in terms of integrating this logistically is more specifically safe and responsible database exchanges. It's not simply just sharing data from the C-SPAN. It's not easy with international organization. It's difficult. So this integration, in order to make it functional, make it work better, is a huge challenge in this regard. On the other side, we also have worries that government commitments with the displaced commitments will maybe be limited by budget pressures. So humanitarian is completely integrated, is still at the mercy of what's happening at a government budget level. So this was also a worry and a challenge. And finally, the worry due to social tensions that can come about from the perception, from the public perception that government aid is going to Venezuelan and they're getting maybe priority above Colombians and the population may shun that. So that would be some of the challenges that we identify. And I think it's going to be very, I'll leave these questions up in the air for the panelists that are coming next. Thank you so much. This is our contact information just in case you have any doubts or any questions or any comments that you want to make to us. And we invite you also to read the report, which is available online. Thank you so much. We have an 8-minute session for Q&A before we go to a short break and before the panel. So I would like to know if anybody has any questions. Those of you that are connected via streaming as well can also ask questions via the chat box. If you have any questions, please raise your hand or put it on the chat. Well, I think it was super interesting everything that I heard of this presentation was wonderful. This research. In fact, my name is Camila Borrego. I work for the interagency group for my mixed migration flow, which is coordinated by UNHCR and OD. And I'm very involved in this issue because I'm in charge of coordinating the needs assessments that we do from the GIFM. So there are several things that really catch my attention, especially on issues related to assistance, because when we are going to do surveys, and these are people that we ourselves express the helps from the GIFM, the people tell us that they have not received assistance. And for me, when we go through the surveys, they don't actually perceive assistance. Like, for example, when you provide orientation in terms of how to access to protection status or whatever, like they don't see that as assistance. I don't think they don't reference that as being an assistance, but rather only when they're given food or something physical, and health services as well. These are one of the which we provide via GIFM as well as one of the main services. And I feel that they don't have that perception that that's a service that they're receiving. We were checking the last survey that we made, and it's very similar to the results of this investigation. 44% of our people surveyed said they received assistance, and these were phone calls to our beneficiaries. So that means they had already received it. So there is that bias from the Venezuelan population that they're not seeing that they're receiving this assistance from international cooperation. They're not treating it as assistance. Another very important issue, which I think is very interesting, is what you spoke about the importance of integrating the Venezuelan population in Colombia. Right now, in fact, once again, from the GIFM, we are doing some very strong work with the national government as well, and more specifically with Migration Colombia and the border management area. We're working together so that all the programs that we actually work with will be done jointly with the government, and more specifically related to the EPPB and the transition to CISBEN. And there's a very strong exercise here, especially about providing information to the population about the steps that are coming next once they are provided the permissions for temporary protection status, because many people stay with the permission, but they don't know that later on they have to request a survey from the CISBEN, so that, like Andres says, since migrants come in with a lower scale, this is when that's precisely what can cause that. When you look at the Colombian population, they have much more access to many more things, and like including health insurance. Only 25% of the Venezuelan migrants are have health coverage, and the Colombian population has a much more bigger coverage, obviously. So there are huge challenges here that we need to continue to close these gaps. I'm almost about to end. And the issue of public policies right now related to migrants, I think the government is also advancing quite well. Precisely right now, we're thinking about launching a compass about the DMP, an integration compass. And I just wanted to highlight that as cooperation, we're doing enormous work to get in unison with the government in order to go ahead. And well, if you want to do anything with us as well, very welcome. We would love to work with you. We have a lot of sources of information. We have surveys that are available. These are public data. You can consult it on our websites as well. R4B, Response for Venezuela. Thank you so much, Camila. Before we give the word over to Andres and Maria Cecilia, I wanted to see there's a question of the people that are connected online. I wanted to know if you measured the level of satisfaction for the subsidy in any rate, right? The displaced population. Do you have like a rating scale that came from Facebook? And I think there was another additional question. That's okay. So please answer the question from Facebook. Well, thank you very much, Camila. Well, we also have to remind themselves that a lot of what we did was in 2021. So there are things that are up to date. And I think the compass already was published. It's in the commenting phase, but it's very close to being published. So we do have a strategy in the midterm and long terms, and clearly there's a lot of work behind the scenes. I think that the populations themselves sometimes don't even realize about how much work is being done, which could be good or bad in a certain fashion. Like we want credit in a certain fashion, but sometimes the simple fact that things are working without people realizing who did what can also be a good thing. So let's say that part of what we want to say is that we have a diagnosis in time that changes with time, and things start improving through time. We also have to think, okay, we already advanced a little bit, but how can we continue to advance? What other things do we find which would be good to also involve? There's always new problems that arise. The good thing is that we've had great conversations and we've shared databases and we share information, which I think is the most important thing in this specific case. It's like what you're saying of going from the PBT to have the C-SPAN survey. There's a lot of different things that are happening. And so the next step, after that step comes the next step, and after that step comes the next step. So once again, it's like in any human relationship, communication is important. And I think that we have to, and especially you guys that are from the GIF are working on this with a new government that's coming in. It would be great to continue the conversations going and build upon what has already been built upon. You were going to say something about the scale? No, well, we didn't have a ranking scale. No. About the satisfaction scale. We didn't ask that in terms of the assistant relays, but we did ask about life satisfaction, or about subjective satisfaction, about well-being, and something that we found was interesting, which is surprising, but it's also aligned with the perspective of the migrant population from Venezuela, is that they have levels of satisfaction that are higher than the displaced internal population. They are more satisfied. But we didn't ask about satisfaction related to the aid as such, but as Andres showed, they do value it quite highly. Almost 50% value it as super important or indispensable. Simply, briefly, I wanted to answer this idea of where the aid comes from. And we did hear this quite a bit in the interviews. They say there's obviously confusion. They say, some people say they don't know where it comes from. I know I get the aid, but I don't know from where. Whether it comes from this agency, a US agency, or if it comes from France. Like, they know it comes from somewhere, but a lot of people don't know where. The people can't identify specifically what agency or what program helped them out sometimes. I think with this data, what can be done is to understand something which I think is fundamental, how they find out about the availability of these services. And it's mostly word of mouth with their friends and their networks. And I think that can be a very productive way of communicating with word to word or face to face, which is great opportunities to talk about the availability of new programs because people talk to each other. Now we're going to have a small coffee break, and we invite everybody to go and pick up your kits with the reports on the back. Those of you that are in person, please go pick them up outside on the tables. And at 10:40 on the dot, we will be here at 10:40 on the dot.
Okay, good morning. We're going to begin our conversation. We have a very important panel today. I want to thank you all for your time and having accepted the participation. We have Gabriel de Momping. He's the leader of humanitarian development in the Office of the World Bank in Colombia. Paula Gaviria, the director of Compass Foundation, Tania Nino, the representative of the Social Protection Program of the World Food Program, Ivan Jimenez, with party from the Emergency and Stabilization of the International Organization from the institutions ODM, and then Dr. Guzman from ANU, and then Ingrid Batista, who is a senior specialist of institutional strengthening to support the victims, also from OEM. We shared OIM, and we shared with you the results of the report previously, and you had carefully listened to the presentations previously. And so what we want to have now is a conversation. It's a very nurtured panel and very pleased to have it. And the first thing we want to ask is how you received these results for the work that you perform in Colombia, or that you have performed, because I've learned that you've also had other responsibilities previously. And so from these results, we would like to hear the reading of those results. from the previous experience, but also from the work that you perform in your own organizations. So I'm going to start a little bit alternation. Gabriel, you start. Okay, so first of all, I'm very happy to be here in Lausanne. This is the first time I'm in an in-person meeting after 2 years of being in Colombia, so I'm very happy. And I want to congratulate the team for an excellent work in everything in terms of analysis, the use of mixed methods, the presentation from both Andres and Maria Cecilia, and also the video. So I'm really very excited about this work, and we've been talking about the focal groups via WhatsApp. That could have been all the presentation today, because that in itself is something I'd never seen. And I'd work in surveys, phone surveys, and focal teams in other countries. So I'm very interested to see how can we adopt this particular method for other studies of the World Bank. So it's really excellent in everything. For this first question, I'm not going to delve into political details, and it's just to say that the work comes in a very important time, because we are undergoing a transition time at the government level. And I believe we all know that with this current government, we've had an administration that has helped a lot to migrants, people from Venezuela, and to strengthen all these policies. And so with this government that is coming now, we find interest, but there's a whole lot of uncertainty on how they're going to promote these policies. So this is a work that it's going to be something that us and the World Bank are going to use as part of our conversation with the new government, with the new administration, to see how we move with policies for displaced, both internal and Venezuelan migrants. Thank you, Korea. I'd like to know from OIM, how do we receive this results? Good morning, everybody. The feeling we have from that, the approach, the internal displacement due to conflict issues and everything, I feel that we've heard a little bit of these feelings. This isn't something that we'd say, I never heard that before from other victims or anything. We've heard all of that. But we always have a great challenge at an international level, and that is the principles that cover all populations, and that Colombia approaches this in a separate view. So from that, it is also important to see everything together, that the integrality is something that pushes us to always work with the government, that are what directs the policies and that can guarantee the rights, that we're always going to be there. People need to know that we're always going to provide support. That is an installed capacity that we're going to leave there on who is the main director of this policy. So it's very interesting to approach that, because internationally we're seen as a very interesting case study, but in the everyday we approach differently to internal displaced populations and migrants. So I think it's very different. And in terms of the result for the displaced or the victims of a conflict, it is an obligation of the state to guarantee their rights. With the law 387 in 97, we've been working with that, and in the 2004 to 5 for the rights of victims of the conflict. So that is how we've struggled to get to this place, is a reivindication. It is a political posture in regards to this, to respond to this kind of population. And so I think it's always important to look into that comprehensiveness and to see how the world sees these topics, because I feel that it's been very diverse internally as well as difficult to put it all together. So like when I approached the first time to the reading of this social protection issues, I was full of doubts because I was very much enrolled with public policy because it's a component. Then repair is another. Compensation is a measure of repair. It's not a transfer of assistance. It's a repair. So you come to those things and you feel that it's important to rethink these things and how public policy is actually structured. And the migrant issue is a new public policy for the country. And to see that these are the social programs the government has had for populations, and so host population is vulnerable. They don't have access to certain rights, similar to Colombian population. So it's important to look into this, all these descriptions. Thank you, Ingrid. Paula? I like to ask you this from both roles you represent. So how do you see the results as the Compass Foundation, but also with your history in public policy and the design of public policies for the victims? Sandra, thank you very much. And the School of Government and all the researchers, because I haven't had the opportunity. And I understand Ingrid. We do this work and we're used to this kind of response, but truth is, I did not have a report be done, and it's very positive in terms of the journey of the governmental response. It is an accumulative of many years and in many things. So victims always are something I put first in the civil society that at the time acquired the rector principle with the T025. I forgot the word, but it's a government that is struggling a lot with what the court was saying to coordinate the policies with the policies of 2011, and then in 2012 we had to give a response to that. And at the time of the exercise of the 1,500 people displaced population, I don't know how many follow-up documents were issued, and it was a government that was incapable of closing those gaps in all of its components. Here we're being talked about prevention, and there is a huge delay in prevention, and with the promise of victim network with all of this that Ingrid had said, and repair and the transformation repair. So here I see a little bit of the intersection with the questions and answers as with the displaced population knows about their rights, their pathway, how they have to do the proceeding. And those are music to our ears, obviously. And I can't be any happier. And obviously looking at the social protection indicators and healthcare education indicators that when I was at the unit up to 2018, we left in the last report that we submitted to the court. And what we said was we told the court, okay, you're here supervising this, and there's certainly a deficit in protection and response, etc. But the government is being incapable to reach and say the pressure with the demands and requests are not helping us respond better with the respond better to the indicators. So we propose to sit down and talk about those issues, trying to agree on how to reach the goals, etc. And that's when we were able to achieve to issue this great achievement. And I feel the satisfaction of what we left in the unit. And so looking at the indicators, and I remember the indicators, for instance, in health is very high as seen here. And at my time with the effective business surveys, we had an even higher. I believe there's an impact due to the pandemic. Full satisfaction. And I also was going to say that it's also satisfaction because I also have my own report. In 2019, the General Secretary, by request of many countries, created a high-level panel to look for a solution to the issue of displacement in the world, saying that it was something that wasn't fully responded to, different to the migrants a little bit with this. It's a greater thing with displaced, and there's a whole deploy and recovery and articulation even stronger to refugees than internal displaced. And so the General Secretary said, let's create a panel so that that topic is still on the table and we can analyze where are like the challenges there. And so that's the report we created. And so in the Americas, I was sitting there, not representing everybody, of course, but we talked to Sandra earlier, and it says that Colombia does have a place in this topic outside, and not just a place because we are the greater displaced record country in the world. And we weren't even looking at the situation of Syria or Ukraine, that it's equals in the historical cumulative, and that is a shame. But it is also an achievement to know that we are able to record and recognize that part, which is a huge step. But Colombia is also known for its work and its response and sophisticated and complex programs to respond to it. So I love it that you are here today, raising the bar even higher with this, as you were saying, with the innovative methodology and everything we were shown, of that recognition and evidence of the journey we've walked upon with the answers, but we need to go beyond. The challenge now is huge, and it has to do with social protection schemes and integration. And I'm very excited to think that there are things still to be shared, learnings to share about the displaced population journey versus this part that I do feel, and I've been working with a lot. I feel that the Venezuelan immigration, we need to create a lot more awareness, like care, interest, coordination. I think a lot of bad practices have been overcome as how it was initially. I think we've learned our lesson and paved the road better, but I feel we need to share a lot more about our learnings, as you've said, in terms of displaced populations. So I'm very happy with that. Thank you, Paula. Carlos. I would like to emphasize on a result, and it's like the half empty glass, looking at this half full glass. Something also very important about the Venezuelan population. I want to see how do you receive that part. Thank you, Sandra. I also joined the gratitude to the government school. Certainly, it all comes in a very good moment. We're closing on the day of the displaced and the refugee. For that need we have today, and to see how we're going to keep covering these gaps that certainly exist. I still share what Paula says. That these gaps can be closed faster. And in terms of displacement, we still have a lot to do. And the normative framework is one that is still need to be strengthened. But what we read from here is that everything helps to this, to keep on working with these offices that have a better relationship with the migrant population and displaced population, but it also brings challenges up. As Ingrid has pointed out, we've mapped a little, but it helps us add more numbers and understand yet another set of dynamics. So I think it also connects very nicely with that change of mentality that we are having in the whole world, I believe, which is that transition with assistance for emergency and that link with development, because of course our response to emergency intends to cover and look into the needs that are specific, but then to be able to achieve in the mid-long term that connection and create that link to social protection, which is the one that enables this. To see what is the assistance that people are getting, but to also see what people are looking into, what they need, where their purpose is to actually have a job and to make their income something stable. So to look how to cover that very weak line to strengthen those structures then. I don't know that I responded to your question, but what I'm saying is that it's very timely and it's a good timing. And so from there are other spaces. And certainly the learning there is key. Thank you, Carlos. Tania, from the global food program, how they see it also related to the strategies and the assistance that is being given in kind and the response to the displaced population. Sure, of course, and thank you very much for the opportunity and the invitation. I find the report is very relevant is because of two particular reasons. I think it was an effort we didn't have to respond to the migration crisis, and the response we have from 2018 is the experience we've gathered. And the first thing is that the document has the report has documented the first sign of the leadership, which is the guidelines to give a limit to monetary transfers, which is where the state says this is a crisis that is greater than us. We need international help, but I lead this. And I think that's very important. And the second is the first effort for actually being able to align it with the social protection system. And so it was to be able to align this so that it wasn't so decompensated in terms of the value that is being given to the migrant population, but also to acknowledge the experience Colombia has in the handing over of monetary or economic transfers. So for a report to actually have it recorded, it's something that really filled me out a lot. I think is unique globally. The Colombian government at the time is in a full crisis at the time, and they couldn't visualize how important it was. There aren't any other exercises I know from countries that have given that limit and guidelines that are being reinforced with the international community. Something that was also inspired by Philippines. And having documented that is something that it really matches what we're discussing here. And then having mentioned the very strong pilot of the social protection support that is reacted to emergencies, I think it really made a milestone for the government and the global food program. And I think we're, as you know, we are evaluating this. And the topic of referral, which is also mentioned there, which is this possibility governments have that it doesn't only apply for the global food program and all other community actors. And that's that when issues take place, they hand them to us. I know very close to the issue in Bogota, and so I think it's worth to being mentioned. So having look into those particulars is very important to me because it documents what is being done in the country so far. And I want to express that I also appreciate that all this effort has been done, and it had to be very big, and it's because it helps us look into in reactive emergency or adapted to emergency response, which is basically the same, and it is how the government reacts upon a crisis. And that's what the program is showing, how the government from the social protection system is reacting to social assistance, education, healthcare, and Colombia has done it. This is an action of a political will, which is historical, and it needs to be recognized. But I also want to mention now how Colombia does this, but what are the particular features that the reactive capacity has in the Colombian system. I know this is very global and very trendy right now, but Colombia has certain specificities, and that is, and I think it's very relevant, is how Colombia, when opening the system to a migrant population, is also doing it for the national population. The healthcare system is same for the nationals as for the migrants. SISBEN, we all know very well this system is the same procedure, both for migrants as for nationals. And so I can see that they do it in this equality of conditions, opening then the system, therefore. And I think the other feature of this reactive capacity is the swiftness they do it with. And then Ivan from OIM, how do you do it? I'm going to stop a little here too. And this is something we talked a lot with Ingrid about during the interventions, because it was interesting to see both perspectives. We can see OIM in Colombia from the 1956, and we've been evolving, and how the different dynamics within Colombia have evolved as well. We arrived in 1956, giving support to migrants of the post-war, those humane movements that were like giving us this first views to the future. This was a positive migration that was hopeful, and it is very particular because we can see it within the regions like Valle del Cauca, Antioquia, the northeast of Colombia. And so we could see this of the last century that is really relevant to the development of this society, Colombia and the industrial part of these regions. It is positive, and as Tania has said, to see how the government can respond and how is that capability to set the international cooperation. And it is different to what happens in other regions of the world. And it's also very interesting to be able to put these population groups in the same place. We find ourselves in the field, and particularly when this started in 2015, when they really started receiving more than 20,000 Colombians that were returning from Venezuela, and to find these population flow within the country and the communities where their settlements were found, and to find the empathy between ones and the other, internal displaced victims and Venezuelans. And if we stop in a very particular case, and it's important to consider that is the displaced Colombians. There are very particular numbers. The returned Colombians are mixed families as they're known, but there is a special particularity, and it was those that were children from Colombian parents did not take away from them the migrant condition. And it was the first time when a returned Colombian would leave the Venezuelan population, and that pretty much faces them to a completely new situation. And I close with this. And it is the important part of the report to see the trust in the Colombian government. When people come to Colombia with a complete lack of trust in the institutionality, in Colombia, they have to pay for everything. And in Venezuela, the institutionality, the authority is what it generates resistance in these people. And what we found here is different. And we can see it from the evaluation, how they go directly to the government. They were talking about the support network, which is the way they move around. And it's to see how in the school, which is a public institution, that they can find both things. They see the empathy, they see a professor, but they also see a director that says, I have 40 children in a classroom, and I rather say just bring all their school certificates validated, and so that we can provide the guarantees. And that's not good to do that, but it's important to highlight the work not only from the governmental entities, but from the very society, showing us that other side, the civil society, and the exercise that we've had, the civil society, that are pretty amazing to see how the communities, beyond looking who is going to come to take what, and a whole series of myths that started to walk around from 2016 up to the pandemic, when they found out themselves that we are enduring the same thing. And that was like one of the testimonials we saw, that when they received the groceries, and it was groceries for everybody, migrants and vulnerable population internally. And I think in that particular is how they're all in the same level. Of course, some topics are not readable, where we can see that there's more response for the migrant population. It's an issue of communication that starts from the experience of the governmental leadership to describe technical limitations. And when we sit with the government and say, we do this that way, and so, and the cooperation, the input from the cooperation is more logistical.
So the government did this behind closed doors, and this is something that is related to protection, a temporary protection, but this was done closed door. The support that we did more was at a logistical level, and all the different organizations, like there was 75 partners that the GFA has between NGOs and et cetera. And we're actually working in pro of the mandate that the government has in terms of cooperation. This is not only highlighted in the report interviewing people and family groups, but also seeing how the government leadership is in one of these types of phenomena. And now during this transition, they announced the reestablishment of relationship, and we begin to have many expectations what's going to happen from this point forward, all the resources. Precisely, I was going to make that last comment for my last question. That has to do with the final results that Maria Cecilia showed in terms of the integration between international cooperation and the Colombian state or government in the implementation and the design of public policies for displaced populations. Gabriela, I wanted to ask you, from your international perspective and having been to other countries, what should be the role of the country and what should be the role of international cooperation in implementing and designing public policies for displaced populations? Well, thank you. I'm not exactly sure that I'm going to speak about what the role should be. I can talk about what the World Bank actually does in cooperation and coordination with other organizations. What we have done quite a lot is technical assistance to governments. And in many cases, based on international experiences, our experience is to bring experiences what has happened in other countries. And it's also great value for other governments. So we would think, hey, they can look in Google and find that information, but truly, despite that there's flows of information in the world, this about bringing experiences from other parts has a lot of value for the government. Another role that we play in the World Bank is to bring financing. This in part comes as a loan, but for issues related to Venezuelan migrants. And in the last few years, there was a lot of sources of international donations or grants from nations. And we, the World Bank, have been able to serve like as a channel or a conduit to bring those international funds to Colombia. So we have many programs, several programs. Last year we had what for us is a loan. It actually recognizes what the government has done, and it gives a loan recognizing this. And it was the first time in the whole world the World Bank actually financed a program only for issues related to immigration, recognizing the government's role here. And this program, it seems we were able to bring in fundraise money from cooperation. It's a loan, but it's also a very attractive loan for the government because it also has a grant portion. We also supported a monetary transfer program with the World Food Program. Our role here was also to provide technical assistance and also with a donation. In this particular case, the program is completely financed by donations or international grants. This is a program, not exactly a pilot program. It's more than a pilot program, but it's a small scale program. It's not to solve the whole world's problem, but in our experience, it has been very positive in this collaboration. And I think that there are several different elements from this experience that are of high value in order to help us form new policies in the future. I'm going to abuse of Paula's experience with the previous government. Unfortunately, due to agenda, we were not able to have people from the government in this panel. But from the government's perspective, the role of the government in terms of international cooperation and the deployment of public policies for displaced population, what is your opinion from the government experience? And also, what do you think in the future? Well, the first thing is, I think Tanya was saying this, the issue of political willingness at the highest level is the focus. And this is also the big finding of this report, the World Report on Displacement. The first step is always political willingness. And political willingness at a president level, at a government level, at a state level, but also political willingness at a local level. And an approximation of, in English, it's called the whole of society approach. Everyone has to be involved in order to respond. And the last thing you showed, or what Andres showed us about this other aid, for example, the role of the academic sector, education, is very important to have joint efforts. So that political willingness and that leadership headed by the government, and Tanya and Ivan were saying this earlier, has to be very clear, like the vision that we have toward where we want to get to with the response. And starting from here, basically, the coordination that has to come from all of this, the planning, joint goals or objectives. We've advanced quite a lot in the previous government with the objectives in the development plan about overcoming vulnerable conditions. Obviously, certain agreements and a leadership, political willingness reflected in leaderships with the numbers. And what I talked about, the official registry is very important. But being on top of all, being up to date on our databases with the Colombian statistics issues, with the DMP, with the CISBEN database. And this is not only a leadership and a political willingness that is just word of mouth, but it has to be reflected. And what I said earlier, plus norms that in Colombia, I'm not saying that there are a lot, but we do have some norms. And what is missing is to just make them be complied with. I'm not sure if Ingrid or the people from IM or from UNHCR worked at that particular moment, but I remember that I had to work quite a lot with cooperation agencies. And I think they like me. I think they love me today a lot. Now I think we're friends. All of us are friends. But at that moment, I bothered them quite a lot. I was like really difficult with them. But it's very difficult for something which is an intangible. What you were talking about this with immigrants is that that view of trust with the Colombian government, the conflict with what has affected more than the 9 million institutions is trust in institutions. And the only way for us to continue to plant that seed is to recover that trust. And the only way for us to contribute to that is to create a political willingness, and that leadership should come from the state. And in cooperation, I think we have advanced quite a bit. Cooperation wasn't that easy in the past. The solutions to what we're doing now, for example, when lasting solutions became a fad about displacement. I remember the people from UNHCR and the people from UNDP, they said that they had a lot of resources. I can't remember exactly. They had soft loans in order to implement solutions in Colombia, that we didn't call it solutions and unity, but these was basically our local return plans. And it didn't have that perfect name that you had, but we were on our way. But in order to conclude, I think that there's been leaps and bounds. There's been huge advances that the international community is beginning to respect. There's a lot of respect for that national leadership, and that's only achieved when we have a common, clear vision, when there's political willingness that is reflected in everything we talked about, obviously in resources, and cooperation becomes a complementary thing. It's very clear that the main humanitarian agent is the unit for victims in the case of all displacements, in the case of confinements, in the case everything that happened when I was leading the unit, and it still continues to be the case. UNHCR, CCR, the Norwegian Council, everyone complemented the unit's actions. They complemented. There's no better example of joint efforts with cooperation entities than that response at the moment. I think there's maybe a better example today with everything related to migrants. But at that moment, that was the best example of united work, virtuous unison with the national government, the state, and cooperation agencies. Tanya, in your previous intervention, you talked about the Arauca pilot program. I would like for you to share about the learnings of that experience in the Arauca project related to this integration between international cooperation agencies and the government. Yes, of course. Well, the Arauca pilot program was due to a coincidence that you mentioned with clarity in the document. It's like how the system becomes more flexible and how the pandemic allows the flexibility to occur. Before the pandemic, we already had a large migrant population in the country, and that has still not achieved or not made the state to react so much as it does when the pandemic comes. What happens is that it becomes a bit more flexible with the pandemic, and it also opens up the door to the migrant population. So basically here, what we understand in this test with food, the crisis was very harsh for the poorest population, but also for the poor population that was not receiving the transfers, the traditional social protection transfers like Familias en Acción, Jóvenes en Acción, and the older adult Colombia Mayor program. So the people here and the migrants were not included, and they were not going to be protected during the pandemic crisis. And what did we do in an agreement with Social Prosperity Office? That there was an element of flexibilizing the system. Social Prosperity, remember that the president issues an emergency decree, and he said that we can exchange all the different databases. And that was, I think that was the most transcendental thing that was done in social protection during the pandemic. Is that why? Because before the state had already identified the sharing databases amongst different state agencies, in between state agencies was very difficult to do. In the pandemic, the government says, I'm going to share everything that I find, and even CSBAN 4, I'm going to share with private parties as well. And all of this was caused by the pandemic. That information of CSBAN populations, poor population that did not receive monetary transfers, that information was shared with us, and we really thank the Colombian state for sharing that information. We implemented a pilot program with reactivating emergencies in Arauca, in the all department or state of Arauca that is specifically catering to that population, a population that is not protected by the social protection system, and to migrants that were not receiving these monetary transfers similar to the Ingreso Solidario program. But I want to connect with a second point that I wanted to mention about the question that you're asking. It's what's happening when we use the databases from the CSPEN program. We realize that, first of all, the official registries become outdated very quickly in Colombia and worldwide. But additionally, we found out that the people that were not in CSPEN database, the people that are not in the system, were not going to benefit from the response or the assistance from the states, nor from international aid. What happens with Ingresos Solidarios or Solidarity Income? So this program takes all these databases and they provide the transfers. Since the migrants were not in the CSPEN database, well, they did not receive the transfers. Only 54,000 migrant families, so out of 3.6 million families that are migrants received this funds from Ingreso Solidario program. This is the second project. What does the community and the government do? We understood that we had to support the CSBAN project. And here there's a very important project because the social protection system is one at a national level, which is what the DNP statistics office says, which is as a technical guidelines, but another one is what happens in the municipalities and in the cities. The operation of the CISBEN happens in the municipalities. So what do we think we have to do as us, as a community and Prueba Mundial de Alimentos, is that we have to actually go do the field work, like what you mentioned. We did this with the ETPB, all the international community, and with the CISBEN at this moment, we have an operation to have the migrant population become part of CISBEN. And this has to be done at a territorial level. So we have to support the operational side. We can't just discuss things. We have to support the operational side. We have to go do the work. This is something that we do. Let me end with something which is also very important to answer the question that you asked. And I'm going to connect this with the World Bank. And it is that this is an operation that we did effectively jointly in Bogota. And what I wanted to say, or the message that I want to transmit here, is that we have to support the efforts of institutionalizing the migration crisis. There are very few examples at a countrywide level, at a subnational level. Bogota goes through a monumental effort to do this, and they have an investment project for migrants. Bogota adapts their information system, which is called the SIRBE, not the CISBEN, a SIRBE project for migrants. And that's a huge effort by Bogota as a city. And this is an example of something that we should support. Thank you, Tanya. Ivan, from the OIM, what is the role of international cooperation and how should it be integrated with the government to cater to the displaced populations? Thank you. Let me go back a little bit. Not only do we need to strengthen communication channels that currently exist within a framework of migration flows, mixed migration flows, we have the interinstitutional cooperation agency. It's a very interesting agencies from the borders areas, from the concierge office, the APC, where we have certain regular spaces, not only for dialogue between the government and institutions, but also within the government itself. Internally speaking, there are these spaces for dialogue for work where we check the different policies and we check what challenges and how we're closing the gaps at an institutional level from the central government level, and how that's reflected in the territory, which is the second point that Tanya mentions. And how do we position the work that we're doing in the territory much better? In the territory, for example, in 2015, we started with an emergency scheme. We had 22 entities come together from the government, together with the participation of cooperation agencies, to try to respond. And it was very interesting and significant because this issue of the emergency for the risk agencies is very clear. And the PNU stayed here, but everybody else left. So we continued through time until 2018. The government said, hey, this issue can't continue to be here. We have to, the people are going to stay here. So this is the first registry. 268,000 people become registered and logged in these databases. And we have like normalization system, the DMF, we have different mechanisms to normalize these migrants' conditions and different. And the government of Colombia created that in the interior. There's international examples as well. International examples, the ones that are closest. This is one of the mandates of Lancor. It's, and for a UNHCR, everybody's a refugee. All Venezuelans are refugees. And we've already been advancing quite a lot in that space of talking about migrants and refugees, the issue of international cooperation and protection. However, at a local level, this institutional scenario has evolved in terms of migration tables, management tables in departments such as Nariño, and like in the city of Pasto, they created these by decree. Bogota, for example, recently created the Intersector Migration Commission, which is very far ahead, but Barranquilla also has certain very interesting processes as well. Within the framework of mixed flows at a national level, we focus on this in the components or the social development office, a very assistant humanitarian-based focus that we're working hand in hand with the government and with USAID support as well, adjusting these responses and these institutional issues, these models of Bogota, of like called Super CADE, is to provide all the local response in only one place, which are centers for holistic centers. And the border agency has this. We're in 9 cities, the cities which are most impacted by migration, but in territories that raise their hands. Pasto says, I want my own. Pereira says, I want my own. And these cities, that's where perhaps the impact of migration is not as strong. However, their own leadership is leading them to make a difference in the agenda. Pereira has visited other territories. For example, Barranquilla came and looked at the model of Supercais in Bogota. They have an integration center, which is impressive, where they're working not only with the humanitarian response area, but the integration center. The Barranquilla Center was created to respond to this, and Tanya was mentioning this. And we highlight this from the Colombian government that they standardized responses for absolutely everyone. In 2019, we launched a white book to try to integrate more than 150 measures that were taken since 2015 when they closed one of the biggest challenges. And I remember quite a lot because in that time, I was working with the organ and we had to go sit down with the Venezuelan military, tell them that there's more than 3,000 children that come to school to Colombia. What do we do with this? Let's sit down and talk, and independent of our differences, our different political institutional differences. It was impressive to see how about this vulnerable population, we began to remove the layers of the onion and we started to focus on the point, and we were able to come up with a transportation scheme, a school bus scheme, and these types of things. And it's basically that. These are the efforts of the government of strengthening the presence in the territories. That's the most important thing. And it's the presence of the territories from cooperation from the government, but from the national government. 10 years ago, we never saw entities such as the Canciller's office just as a presence in the territory. Now, the Gerencia Fronteras has a presence. The national government has a very important presence. Now, it's very valuable, and it's with accompanying local authorities. And for many years, we hear, no, that the government designs measures and enforces the locals to do them, but no longer. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that the national government that's coming in will have to deal with as well. We check the national infrastructure and how they standardize responses, because sometimes they just give more work to functionaries, but there's challenges with documentation. What is PBT? Well, I don't, if I received this or not received this. They talked about this with the issue of access to financial services for migrant populations. There's a series of things that have to be checked. This is one of the main recommendations, to check the institutional architecture for the different entities that are trying to respond. Thank you, Ivan. In order to close this last cycle to Carlos and to Ingrid, let me ask you the same question, thinking about the future, about the specific issue. The integration between international cooperation and the government. How do you see it towards the future in order to potentialize the positive affectations for the migrant populations? Well, Sandra, thank you very much. I wanted to highlight from UNHCR, the role that we see is not a separate role from cooperation, but rather we see that we have a complementary role. We're almost like jumping on the bus that the government's on, and we're going there and we're starting to support the government, without saying that it's always like that, but that's more of the roadmap. And without a doubt, we believe that we're on the right path today in terms of refugees and immigration. With TPP, we see that there's policies more than the government state that is favoring all of these processes. Like the integration is something that we need and that we're going to continue to work with. And I would also highlight that something more specific from cooperation agencies and more specifically from UNHCR. This is a space that we have despite limited resources to come in, propose things. And I have a very concrete example for that UNHCR started two years ago. Job initiatives that started 2 years ago. That's similar to something that they did in Brazil that we learned quite a lot with, and they were very positive today. I already went through a first pilot program here. And from UNHCR, we began to develop this jointly with the Ministry of Work and the border management area. And today is becoming more relevant. All of this to tell you all that this space that we have as an agency allows us to come to the table with new proposals and maybe test at a lower scale or do a proof of concept or something that we think that can help us to contribute to these processes. So trying to answer your question, I think that these role is to complement things that maybe what they're not achieving from the government as far as we want, and bring new fresh ideas of how we can actually achieve that final objective of having that integration and protection from UNHCR in our case. Another key issue has to do with the strengthening of the interagency cooperation. And I think there's something that is an insignia in Colombia, which is the GBIN, how it's working. Tanya mentions the CISBEN, which is a huge operation that they're working with the DMP office, where they brought different agencies to the table to also support the process. So I think we need to continue these processes. We need identifying the strengths of each of these processes and how from the different missions each different stakeholder can contribute to that same purpose, which at the end of the day is to protect people and to improve people's lives. So I believe that we're very aligned. It's very beautiful to hear what is happening and seeing that from the government again, and mentioning this from my own perspective as a state policy, that we're able to, we're starting to establish and we're changing the mental mindset or that chip and how we understand things and how we receive refugees and immigrants. I think that's it, Ingrid. I feel that I agree with a lot of everything that is being said, and I would also highlight another issue in terms of the roles of the government and in terms of cooperation, which I think is very clear in the study. I think that the information, when you guys say, people say, I'm not sure it comes from, but everybody says it comes from the government. I say, is that's the role of the government? You have to lead, you have to have the willingness of doing things, and we jump on board. That's one of the fights, that whatever name you want to give it, whatever. I think I agree with that, and we were saying this. I'm not sure what the name should be, integración social, or returning of the populations, lasting solutions, whatever. But we've learned quite a lot, apart from the concept or the name that we give it, and of recognizing that from cooperation, we have many international guidelines that we can use as well. And then for the specific case of Colombia, what Paula says, I think that they call us for everything. Let's consult Colombia. The case of Colombia, let's look at Colombia for everything. Let's see what happened in Colombia. Because in reality, here we have a capacity to design some incredible things. Obviously, these operations cost, tournament operation has its cost, but I think that when things are done, they make a difference. And I share a lot with Paula says. I think that the first recommendations are, so please don't put these lessons learned to aside. We've learned quite a lot, really. I hear the issue of migration has been, and I say the fight that the victim population would like to come into CISBEN was very difficult. But it's like, but that's the way in how we work with social issues in the country. And obviously today it's clear, and the statistics tell us, yes, the victims are more vulnerable than the poor population in the country, because we have this in a location where, for me, and in everything that we've seen, and these types of things, I think really help out on this. It's like the data or the big data collection, for example, this issue of cross-referencing information and the challenges, trying to have a log of victims crossing 52 databases, which don't read each other. That's because my operating system doesn't work with another one. That's the government's responsibility, but it's the same government. What do you mean? So now, having learned from all of that, it's making things much easier. And I think with the displaced population, internal displaced population and victims, we learn a lot. So I hear them and I say, how great would it have been that we had worked with 10 years with the loss? How great would it have been to do all of this at the very beginning? But we had to go through this period in order to have that clarity. I think that experience is very valuable. And I think sharing information is very valuable as well. And I think, yes, for me, the role of the government is to have leadership and willingness and cooperation. Hey, let's help the government. I have the capacity to come in, and perhaps I have the resources now, and let's start rolling with, well, and you tell me how to do it. And I think that makes the biggest difference in the world. And I also feel that there are two very important things that we should not leave behind, which I think is difficult for us. It's difficult for everyone. It's one, having clear communication. I think from 2015, when we had the migration process start, and thanks to the pandemic, that perception actually erased a little bit, but they forgot about the victims, and now the priority was only migrants. That's so the policies of victims no longer exist, and etc. And if the money is going where's it going? And to talk about migration or displacement in general generated a lot of noise. And I think communication had to be clear, and at the end, every entity has their own resources, their contributions. And I think that this is a message that has to continue to be clear. And the perception in the territory, I do think that a territorial focus is key. So we think about many things here with so many ministries, so many departments, so many different ways of operating. And then if you go to a municipality like Policarpa Nariño, and if you visit the complex, the peace council or the law victims, oh, if si llegó migrar, the same 5 people always sit down in all 5 meetings. So the capacity, institution capacity is different there. And I think the territorial focus is very valuable. And surely you guys in your reporting and your numbers, you can see these differences. The biggest differences are like between Cucuta and Bogota, really. That really has to generate a different approximation. We have to recognize this in a different fashion. And I think that at a very large scale, but I think this is a very valuable experience, is the programs with development with a territorial focus. So that we all live here. If what we need is school for a migrant child, the displaced, the victim child, the poor child, a child of our incorporated park soldier or something, we need to create a school. I think that's it. We have to recognize that focus about the territory, apart from the diversity of population that we coexist with every day. So I would maybe focus on that. Thank you, Ingrid. In order to close, another question looking at the future, about looking at the next government. From your experiences, from the lessons learned, from your experiences, but also based on the results that we discussed today, what recommendations, what specific things would you share with the next government? And maybe I'm going to go in the same order as last time to close. Well, this is a very practical experience for me because we're actually preparing our notes right now for policies to provide our notes to the new government. There's something I wanted to say before. I really like from the study that it touches upon both issues about internal displacement and Venezuelan migrants. And yesterday I was talking to my team about a political note that they wrote about Venezuelan migrants. But I said, hey, we have to talk about the internal population as well, because it's another very important issue, especially for the government that's incoming, that has a vice president that identifies ourselves as a displaced person. We have to touch upon this issue. So I really like how the study was done with both populations. So I think since we're having a new government and they're coming in with a huge agenda, and that's my experience working in other countries, when there is a government transitions, it's very difficult to maintain the attention of the new counterparts as well, because they have so many things on their plate. They're working 20 hours a day, trying to implement 1,000 things. So we can't just present excessive or 100 ideas. No, we have to have maybe 2 or 3 points that should be focused on. I think the basic point that I come from this report that we're going to try to work with an incoming government is for them to continue to keep on their radar the issue of Venezuelan migrants, that they should consider the Venezuelan migrants' needs, and that something needs to be done. Something different has to be done for the groups and also for internal displaced people. Despite, I think there's less of a danger that those fall off the radar. But this is a very important basic point, but it's the most important message that we need to focus on right now. In very practical terms, I think that very briefly, the new government is going to have something called solidarity taxes, because the program is going to work until this December. This year it was created as an emergency program for the pandemic, and it was extended till December. And the law that extended the program says that there has to be a revision and analysis and what we have to do next. But the new government comes in August, and very quickly they're going to have to make certain decisions of what they do with this program. Our suggestions would be to continue to spearhead this program and follow it and can have it continuing, but better integrated with other programs as well, and do something more specific for internal displaced groups and Venezuelan migrants within this program. And that study that showcases the importance of this program for all of them is going to be very important evidence for this discussion.
Okay, so the government that this administration that is about to end was talking about the building part. And I think that's like the most important part to keep in mind in Colombia, with so many gaps and opportunities to build upon what's built and the cumulative that's there. I think that besides that, there are huge expectations, like in the promises of the incoming administration, with dimensions that go from the symbolic, clearly, from having an Afro-descendant vice president who is a leader from the environmental part, the Ministry of the Equality that is supposed to be created, that has to do a lot with what we've talked about today. So I feel that there are huge challenges ahead. And well, of course, we patted our shoulders recently and said we feel very happy with our board and all of that, but the glass is still just half full. And there's so much to do, particularly with the ethnic population in Colombia, where we had this enormous opportunity to close those gaps, and it didn't have that focus. But if you look into displaced population plus Afro-descendant and indigenous populations, we clearly have a lot more relayed indicators. And in terms of rights, what they have in terms of access to lands, the huge opportunities, and that light at the end of the tunnel, that it really fills me up with a lot of hope to work straight with the agreement and all those access promises that we have there to close those gaps, and also with the fields and people that live in rural areas. But the challenges that are still there in the post-pandemic impact in terms of income, employment, the victimized population that is still facing these vulnerability gaps due to precisely not so much the lag, delayed fulfillment of promises to those that are displaced, but the long-term promises as well, that actually integration that comes from the possibility to have an income, to have means of sustenance, and a local population that can have a response that is more long-term, that our challenges this new administration will face, that hopefully they'll be able to comply with, because what it could happen is to face yet a whole new frustration. The victim population can't take any more frustration. So the law, the victims law is extended 2 years longer because the registration increased. We couldn't do it in these 2 years of term to be able to achieve all we've said. So there's an extension to it for 2 more years, and all studies are saying that we're not even covering for 10 more years, but the Congress didn't want to extend it even longer to let us plan further and stop promising things we can't comply with. So this government will have to send messages of transparency. The victim population, the migrant population, the displaced population demand transparency. And that's something that we've learned, at least from my work at the unit. The victim population are citizens, and they understand, if they're explained of what that they have to endure certain prioritizations, that they have to lock into going to certain things first. And that demands, as we've said earlier, from maximum political will, leadership at a country level, and certainly the coordination and permanent support that we've had from the international cooperation. And I also want to take the opportunity that I have this mic to thank you and say goodbye. I had to leave like 30 minutes ago, but I just wanted to stay here a little longer. Thank you, Tania. Yes, thank you. I have yet other recommendations. If I were asked at all, I have 3 recommendations. Good, we're recording, so we'll replicate those recommendations. Okay, the first one is I'll look into this solidarity income, which is in the governmental agenda, and that is in the basic income plan. And we had monetary transfers that we've said here are very important. Families in Action has been the 3rd most important program in the region, but it's certainly not sustainable to have 5 programs. We have to look into basic or minimum income that it's including to migrant population and with less standardization to be able to cover the specificities of victim populations as well. So we have to look into the basic income. It's not going to be easy because it's got to look into the legislation. It's not easy. It's going to take some time, but I think that's going to be the first recommendation. The second is that from the international community, we need to strengthen the looking into the new scenario of regularization in the country. And we don't know that yet. We don't know what's the status regularization is in the country. And we have this huge pressure with suspend that very much relies on the support we've had in the temporary protection. We know there have been delays in the delivery and the printing and the population claiming for permits, that there have been errors. So there's a whole lot of things happening in regularization, but we also know that there are many who did not register to the program, and we don't know why. So right now, we don't know what is the program of regularization in the country. That is the nationalization of the migrants in the country. And that's also affecting public policy. And my 3rd recommendation for the government, when you hand them over this recording, it's something that also comes from our operative experience. This is an agency that is in situ. That's a little bit of our identity. And these operations have shown, and something you say in the report already, that although the principle of migration crisis with males, mostly right now is mostly female. So what we've done so far, we have found that 57% of that population are women. But additional to that, we work with the World Bank in Bogota with the CISBEN, but also with the SILBE, which is the social integration system in the district, that is telling us that it's a 65% of women and 71% of the leaders are women. So we certainly need to create public policy with gender approach, because the migration and this study has shown that. So those will be my recommendations. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you. Well, Paula had mentioned this, and I think it's very important, something we found in the handing over of the former administration to this one, and that is to give continuity to the topics that are already being addressed, particularly in terms of the management of the Venezuelan migration, facing changes and others. And what we did was we moved on what it was being done, and the policies that were being looked and giving continuity to. And that is very important. And then something that the elected president has said was to mention the territories. So the national development plan is going to be built from the territories, and that is an opportunity that we had in the current plan, but the migrant population was quite marginal. Although the local ones, we were able to work with 9 local authorities and indirectly with 9 governor's office and the migrating component as well, which is a huge milestone, an initiative of local authorities saying, we have this population here, how can we respond to them? And that's like the first starting point. And then what I think is the most important part here, what Paula had mentioned, and I'm going to leave it there, is to be clear in terms of the handling of expectation. The experience has shown that when you talk directly to people, then expectation is something that you can address, and looking into commitments to commit and to comply. It could be a double-edged sword, and it could represent a lot of risks for the governmental management. Thank you, Carlos, for your recommendations as well. I think we're very much aligned. I just highlight that it is key to look into that approach and the approach of the ages and gender, which is something we really need to look into every program we need to develop because it is a need today. It exists. We look at that in the field all the time. It's a key topic that we need to be working with constantly with very clear guidelines that we have in our program proposal to keep on strengthening these processes. Second, there is a particular topic we've started navigating and is the innovating financing. And I think this is something that it's very relevant to discussion because there's our new windows that help us strengthen our reach and look into different approaches to focus to a logic more intended to results. It may not apply to all cases, but at least the complex has stipulated that part a lot more. And we're also trying to bring on the table that topic, not only for migration, Venezuelan migration, but also for the general displaced population and to see how can we articulate from there. And third, I just say that as Tania says, we're trying to solve the legal documentation for the migrant population, but now we have the actual challenge. We have seen many boundaries. The very document is not sufficient to be able to put together the integration mechanisms we want. So certainly we need to keep the momentum, to keep a very good articulation between the national and the territorial governments. That is key to remain articulated from all the areas and from all those areas to be able to contribute to it. I think I go back to what I've said earlier, the territorial approach to be, which is what the new elected president has also brought out. And the voting map showed it where he got the most people voting for him. And we have then to go to him to link him into these processes as well, not only for the national development plan. And I certainly believe we have to be responsible with the objectives the development plan has. So I think it's going to be a very meaningful work, as Paula had said, in terms of public policies and for victims and their natural link as a non-repetition measure, as has been discussed with the guerrilla, ex-guerrilla groups. So there's a time that we need to look into. It's a 10-year coverage, both for the law and the agreement, but we see that progress has not been so much so, and it needs to be looked into. And it be valuable learned lesson this living government is living us with, and how to articulate plans to put together initiatives with national plans, with collective repair. And if there are these roadmaps for migrants, is something we need to look into so that the territorial part of that can be added. And I say it because there are very clear initiatives that could allow to help us see which ones am I complying with, and that way I can create the actual goals that are missing. And it helps us maximize resources, certainly. And then the clear message, we have to be very clear. And I think it's a great challenge when that message is being conveyed by someone who knows how to work with us. Like Gabrielle says, the vice president acknowledges herself as an Afro-descendant, as a victim. And so from her very sensitive place, she's very clear on how to adhere to the dynamic of this policy, which isn't easy. And in that very good design of a policy that I don't know in detail of the migration topics, it takes a while, and to adapt it, all those differential approaches, That's a challenge. And there's like a new international approach to this, which is Kids Nexus Human Development, and how are we going to add those? So it's not just to work in care, development, or peace, but these three things align together and put in the same place. It's what are going to make a difference. And I think integrality and work, but this just happens in one place, the whole territory, and the territory needs to make a difference. Thank you, Ingrid. And with these, we close, and I want to thank our panel and all of you here in the auditorium and online. And as my colleagues have mentioned, we also have a PDF version in Spanish and English of this report that is already loaded in the repository of this study. Thank you for a very constructive conversation. I think the message of building upon what's built, I think, are very good messages, and we promise that for the next government to consider it, we're going to be able to create these conversations in a more constructive way to reach displaced populations. Thank you very much.